And now on WRS, Michael McKay with the McKay Interview.
Hello everyone. As the public health crisis caused by COVID-19 and the coronavirus continues, we've seen all around us the dramatic effect it has had on the global economy and most nations. Now, this interview is being recorded on the 6th of May. I mention the date because events unfold quickly and things change. Already the authorities in some countries have started to open slowly, almost gingerly after weeks of lockdown, to allow people to leave their homes, for children to return to school, and for people to go back to their places of work, slowly and tentatively. Switzerland is doing this now, but there's no rule book to follow. It's a new situation. It's right that early on in this mini-series, which I'm devoting to the pandemic, that we should look at the world of work. And that is why my guest today is one of the best qualified to share his thoughts with us on this important subject. Almost 6 years ago to today, I visited Guy Ryder, the Director General of the International Labour Organization, at his office in Geneva. It was a warm and sunny spring day. I remember it very clearly. Today I have to rely on Zoom. Such a pity, but what to do? For listeners who don't know, the ILO is one of the oldest of the international organizations in Geneva, having been created in 1919, 101 years ago as part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War. Founded on the basic belief that universal and lasting peace could be accomplished only if based on social justice, it has stood the test of time, the turmoil, the economic booms and busts of the 20th and early 21st century, and is still going strong. Hello, Guy. Thanks for making time for me in these extraordinary days of pandemic to share your views on the crisis and what follows. I'm only sorry that we cannot meet face to face.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you again, Michael. Thanks for the invitation, even if it is at a safe distance. It has to be like that.
It has to be that. It has to be that. Guy, in this brief interview, my questions are about your perspective on what is going on now and how you think the world that you deal with will change once we come out of this health crisis that has triggered a huge economic crisis. My first question is this. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, apart from the great human tragedy of those who've lost their lives and their families that grieve for them, please tell me what strikes you most forcefully about this world health crisis when seen through the prism which you at the International Labour Organization view the world.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what really comes through from our perspective, Michael, is just how this pandemic has brought to the surface the fragilities and the precariousness of our existence, both in terms of health, but from an ILO perspective, in terms of our world of work. I mean, we find literally billions of people in situations of the greatest distress. Their livelihoods have been disrupted. So I think that feeling of fragility, of danger, of fear is very close to the surface. And that underlines, I think, the second point about this particular crisis. Whether you call it a health crisis, whether you call it an economic and a social crisis, it is, above all, a human crisis. The impact of this crisis, compare it even to that financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which you remember, you reported. Somehow this is a much more visceral, fearful experience. And I think that is perhaps one of the reasons, in addition to the scale of the problems that we face, while this pandemic is going to have very long-lasting repercussions in the world of work and beyond that.
Guy, you told me when we last had a radio discussion like this 6 years ago that the ILO was and is the one tripartite organization in this multilateral area. What good now are the tripartite conventions that you negotiate when large chunks of member countries' economies have just disappeared because of the lockdown and concomitant closing of businesses due to the restrictions on the movement of people in so many countries?
Yeah, I mean, you pointed out in your introduction that this ILO, rather strange organization, the oldest 100-year-old organization of the international system, was set up, and I think it was very prescient, on the basis of the interaction of governments, workers and employers' organizations. And these are not invited, they're part of the decision-making process. Now, what relevance today? Because some people tend to see that sometimes as rather an old-fashioned or an outmoded way of doing things. What I would put to you and the people listening to us is the reality. Just look at the evidence. Those countries which are handling best this crisis are those where we have the capacity of employers companies sitting with their workforces, with governments coming in to support, to try to work out practical solutions. Now, this has been the case over the last month. We're sitting in Switzerland. This is a country with very large numbers of people on what we call technical unemployment. So they remain attached to their company, to their jobs, and they're getting public subsidies to retain their workplaces. And, you know, around the world, the countries which are doing best are those where workers, employers, governments are sitting together, keeping the employment relationship in place, providing support for enterprises so that they do not fall victim to this pandemic. And I'm absolutely sure that this will equip those countries much better when we do come to the return to work and the exit strategy from this crisis. So my view is the pandemic is showing very clearly not the irrelevance or the outmoded nature of this tripartite cooperation, but its absolute relevance and topicality.
Thanks, Guy. Today, my guest is Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, and we're speaking via Zoom. Guy, I'm just going to ask you in my next question to go into just a little bit more detail on what you just said before. The realities of this pandemic are that hard times stare many of us, whether workers, employers, or governments, in the face. What can you, at the ILO, do to make a tangible difference? Large as the ILO is, Guy, is it truly nimble enough to make a real difference to workers who are experiencing almost immediate loss of income and companies, employers facing bankruptcy or imminent bankruptcy?
Okay, as we look to where we need to go in the coming weeks and months, and things are moving very quickly, let's start with where we are today. The ILO has estimated that on the basis of the reduction in hours actually worked in the world, the loss as a result of this pandemic has been of the order of 305 million full-time job equivalents around the world.
305 million.
305 million.
Million, you know, yeah. I didn't hear what you said probably.
The global economy has fallen off the cliff.
That's right.
It's fallen off the cliff. And at the moment, we're still falling down as countries lock down. Now, what we can expect, it's imminent in Switzerland and it will be imminent in other countries, is for the unlocking to reduce those dramatic numbers quite quickly. So I think that 305 million will come down.
You believe that, do you? That it'll happen quite
absolutely.
Quickly? Okay.
It will, because as Switzerland sends people back to work, France does the same, Germany is doing. In the short and immediate terms, that's going to come down. So we will stop falling from the cliff. But I think you're pointing to something which is rather more challenging in terms of being very precise about predictions. What's this recovery? How are we going to crawl out of this situation? And I think there are two or three variables which I can't predict, but which I think are relevant. The first, of course, is, well, what will be the forward trajectory of this pandemic? Are we going to have to live with social distancing and all of these precautionary measures for the long term? Nobody knows when that vaccine is going to become available. That's the first thing. Secondly, you know, when the fall from the cliff stops, what will be the level of mortality of enterprises and jobs? You know, how many otherwise viable companies will have gone out of business? How many people will be jobless? We hear every day news of large-scale layoffs of workers around the world. So I think there is going to be substantial mortality. And the level of that mortality and unemployment will obviously dictate where we go in the future. And thirdly, and I think this is a really difficult question, we've seen governments setting aside the rule book, haven't we, when it comes to deficits and debt levels and spending. Quite rightly, governments have thrown large quantities of resources, at least those governments who have the resources, to try to keep things going. Now, at the end, we know that we're going to come out of this pandemic with very high levels of debt. And here is the dilemma, in my view. Are we going to apply the same sorts of criteria that we did in 2010 when austerity came in? Here is the dilemma. Are we going to now argue for putting our foot on the accelerator to get the economy back into motion and up to speed, and then very quickly apply the austerity brakes as the financial realities come into shape?
Sorry, go on. And let me just press you on.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, finish your point.
No, just saying it's going to be a test of whether we learned anything from the previous financial crisis, because we got that exit trajectory wrong. We overdid austerity. So, accelerate and then brakes could send us off the road in a bad way.
So I just want to press you on the word. I deliberately chose the word nimble because I know you're a fairly large organization. And I just wanted to know within your own mind and the way you're set up, have you been able to structure or restructure yourself to be nimble in terms of responding to this just changing situation? See the point I'm making?
I absolutely do.
Yeah.
Nimble is not the adjective that we normally apply to big international bureaucracies.
Exactly.
About that. If I were to tell you anything different, you would have a smile on your face on the radio. And yet, and somehow, the conditions of lockdown have helped us on this, Michael.
Really?
Firstly, because we put aside, because of force of circumstances, our normal ways of working, our normal work programs, and we have focused all of our efforts in trying to promote the right sorts of policies, assist our member states in the type of COVID responses we think they need to make. That could be in the form of social protection, safety and health advice, our advocacy in the UN system. So I would say that today we're looking a bit more nimble than we normally are. So very conscious of the point you make, but I think we're living up to the challenge.
Last question, because the clock is ticking on me on this one, to use a well-known phrase. You taught me a phrase once, Guy, which I've always remembered, the formalization of the informal. How does that work now in this economic crisis that many of us face, in a world where the gig economy and the self-employed are now much more widespread and numerous than, say, 10 or 15 years ago? I'm not just talking about poorer countries, but also in the wealthier countries, like the UK and other places, people like myself working as independent people. Yeah.
Okay, let's make a distinction between informal work and other forms of what we call non-standard jobs, freelance, independents, gig workers.
Please.
Formality are those people who work outside the coverage of labour legislation, outside declared work. They're really below the radar screen. And here is a startling statistic. 6 out of 10 people in the world work in informality. In some parts of the developing world, that's up to 90%.
Yeah.
These are the people for whom this pandemic has become a struggle for survival.
And this is essentially a cash economy.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, look at the day labourers in India. It's a great example. Often many of them internal migrants sent home overnight. And they're telling us, the Prime Minister of Pakistan's just written to me, the choice here is, we either stay at home and protect us and we either protect ourselves from the virus or we starve to death. It's a real impossible dilemma. But you're pointing, I think, as well, Michael, to another phenomenon. We have seen the growth of all these different forms of work, gig economy, growth of independent work. And, these have grown up, but they've not always been accompanied by the right sorts of protections and regulation. So we see gig workers. These aren't people sitting in sub-Saharan Africa. These are people sitting in Manhattan.
That's right.
Bread lines. They're in the soup kitchens because they've got no fallback. So we need to be careful as we plan the trajectory of this diversified future of work.
Guys, thanks so much for your insights and for answering all my questions. Let's hope for a full recovery for all. My guest today has been Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization in Geneva.
That was the McKay Interview with Michael McKay. And don't forget, you can hear that interview again on our website, worldradio.ch.